The alarm clock rang for the third time that Saturday morning, but Elizabeth had been awake since the first signal. With heavy eyes and a body begging for rest, she got up and went straight to the kitchen. The cold cement floor under her feet reinforced the simplicity of the house, as well as the worn but always clean furniture. She took the kettle, filled it with water, and placed it on the stove. While waiting for the coffee to boil, she fixed her hair in a tight bun and checked her work bag one last time. "Today will be tough, but I'll be back before dinner," she said quietly, trying to believe her own words. Peter appeared at the kitchen door, still wearing his wrinkled sleep t-shirt, his blonde hair disheveled, and his eyes attentive to his mother. Even so young, he noticed everything. He slowly pulled out a chair and sat down, resting his thin arms on the table. Elizabeth placed 2 slices of bread on his plate and sat beside him. "Let's have breakfast together before you go," she said, trying to smile. The boy nodded, but didn't seem excited. "Will you be gone long today, Mom?" he asked in a low voice. "Just until late afternoon, son. There's no other way," she replied, running her hand over his forehead. Shortly after, already dressed with her uniform ready in her bag, Elizabeth called a rideshare and walked with Peter to the gate. The small street was still quiet, and the cold wind cut across both their faces. Peter held his backpack tightly, as if expecting the destination to be worse than anticipated. As they got into the car, the boy remained silent, looking out the window without interest. Elizabeth observed his face in the reflection, and guilt weighed heavy in her chest. "It's just for today, okay? Tomorrow we'll play all day," she said tenderly. "I'll behave, Mummy, just like you always ask," he replied. Elizabeth's parents' mansion was in an upscale neighborhood, surrounded by high walls and an automatic gate. When they rang the bell, they were greeted by Margaret, who wore a light dress and red lipstick even so early. She glanced briefly at Peter and then turned to her daughter. "Working today too? That boy seems to grow only on wind and obligation." Elizabeth took a deep breath but didn't respond. Logan appeared next in a dress shirt and reading glasses. "Brought him?" he said, looking at Peter as if he were a delivery. "He's here. He'll spend the day with you," the daughter responded coldly. As Elizabeth said goodbye with a kiss on her son's forehead, Logan had already walked away, and Margaret was busy with her phone. Deborah, who was organizing kitchen towels in the kitchen near the entrance, looked up and came to meet Peter. "Come with me, dear. Today we have honey cookies," she said with a gentle smile. The boy squeezed his mother's hand one last time before following the only person who really cared about him in that house. "I'll be back before dinner, son. Behave, and if anything happens, talk to the kitchen lady," said Elizabeth, trying to keep her voice steady. "Before we begin, comment where you're watching this story from and subscribe to the channel to keep following." Inside the mansion, Peter followed Deborah's steps through the wide corridors, decorated with mirrors and golden objects. Every corner of that house seemed to shine in a cold way, without human warmth. On the way to the kitchen, Margaret passed by them and tossed a comment into the air. "Don't let him run around. Last week he scratched the floor with that ridiculous toy car." Deborah just nodded, without arguing. Peter pretended not to hear but walked more slowly. "They don't like the noise of my toys," he muttered quietly. "Here you can play as long as you're with me. I promise no one will bother you while I'm around," Deborah replied sweetly. The morning passed between simple tasks and silent moments. Deborah let the boy handle the cutlery, organize the bread, and even choose the fruits for the juice. He liked helping because there he felt he had some purpose. Meanwhile, Logan and Margaret circulated between calls and concerns about Brian's wedding. "Nothing can go wrong at the party. He deserves the best," Margaret said while arranging fake flowers on the dining table. Logan was on the phone talking about imported drinks and seemed to forget there was a child in the house. "They talk about him as if he were a king," thought Peter, while stirring sugar with a wooden spoon. In the middle of the afternoon, Peter asked to play a little in the hallway near the stairs. Deborah agreed as long as he stayed nearby. The boy took the wooden cart that he had assembled himself with his mother's help and began to push it slowly, imitating the sound of an engine. Logan passed by him with a folder of documents and said without stopping, "Be more careful, boy. This isn't a playground." Peter stopped immediately, placing the toy against the wall. "Maybe I should just sit in the corner like they want," he thought, sitting down on the carpet. Almost at the end of the afternoon, Brian arrived. Margaret ran to welcome him with hugs and compliments. Logan smiled like he hadn't smiled in days. Peter observed from a distance, hidden behind an armchair, while listening to phrases like "You are our pride" and "Everything will be perfect at your wedding." None of them noticed the boy there. Deborah, returning from the laundry room, saw the scene and crouched down beside him. "Is everything okay?" she asked in a low voice. "They never look at me like that." "I think I'm just a visitor who stayed too long," Peter replied, trying not to seem hurt. "You are much more than that. You just need to be in the right place to be seen." At the end of the day, Deborah prepared a light snack for Peter while the employers finished talking on the porch about the party invitations. The boy sat at the table and thanked her even before touching the food. "You're the only person here who really talks to me," he said. Deborah smiled, sitting next to him. "And you're the only one who listens to me attentively. I think we make a good pair." Peter then rested his face on his arms and said in a soft tone, "I like it when my mom leaves me with you, but I don't like staying here." Deborah sighed, running her hand through his hair. "Not everything is as it should be, but we still find a way to be okay." As night began to fall, the atmosphere of the house remained the same, cold, organized, and without space for real affection. Logan was collecting papers, Margaret was putting away crystal glasses, and Brian had already gone upstairs. Deborah finished washing the dishes and took Peter to the guest room, carefully arranging the pillows. The boy lay down in silence, looking at the ceiling. "My bed at home is smaller, but it's happier," he said. Deborah turned off the lamp and replied, sitting on the edge of the bed, "The happiness of a place lives in the people who live in it." Before leaving, she heard Peter say in a low voice, "When I grow up, I want to live with my mom forever." She just smiled and closed the door slowly. That Saturday afternoon, no explosion happened, no major change was made, but something began to form inside Peter. The awareness that even so small, he could already recognize who really saw him and who just tolerated him. While he slept, his heart beat calmly, knowing that at least for a few hours someone was truly taking care of him. And without knowing it, he was already beginning to understand that family isn't just who shares a name, but who shares a look. "I hope Mom comes back early tomorrow. I want to tell her what I learned today." And silence filled the room more than any noble presence in that house. Sunday dawned silently inside the mansion. The sun slowly entered through the high windows, reflecting on the perfectly cleaned furniture. Peter woke up alone in the guest room, not knowing for sure if it was early or late. He stretched slowly, put on his shoes and looked around. The silence was absolute, as if no one else was in the house. He opened the door carefully and peeked into the hallway. He walked slowly to the wide staircase that led to the upper floor. Curious, he climbed one step at a time, holding on to the golden handrail. "The house seems empty. Did everyone leave and leave me here?" At the top of the stairs, he spotted one of the internal balconies. It was a beautiful space with glass railings, white carpet, and well-kept potted plants. The sliding door was ajar. Peter walked up to it, looking at the shiny floor that reflected the ceiling like a mirror. He stopped at the edge and stood watching below. It was high, but not enough to immediately frighten him. He carefully climbed onto a small stool that someone had left in the corner. He wanted to see better. The balance was fragile, and a false move made his body lean forward. "If I stretch just a little more, maybe I'll see the whole garden." The imbalance was immediate. The stool slipped, and Peter felt his feet leave the spot. He screamed reflexively, but had no time to think. Deborah, who was coming down the hallway with a pile of towels, heard the sound of the object hitting the floor and instinctively ran. She arrived at the exact moment the boy was already falling forward. She grabbed him by the arm, pulling hard and throwing him backward. Both fell to the floor, breathless. Peter was trembling, his face pale and eyes wide. Deborah wrapped her arms around him without saying anything for a few seconds. "Everything's okay now, I'm with you. You're safe." Peter was still crying when Margaret appeared on the veranda, with an irritated expression. "But what was that? Why is he on the floor like that?" Deborah got up, helped Peter to his feet, and pointed to the overturned stool. "He almost fell from here. He was alone. No one saw." Margaret raised her eyebrows and shook her head with contempt. "Always making drama. This boy needs to learn how to behave." Peter held Deborah's hand tightly, and she felt the fear in the grip of his fingers. He wasn't making a mess. He was exploring alone because no one was accompanying him, she said, in a firm tone. Logan appeared shortly after, neat as always and already with a tense countenance. Deborah, still holding Peter, explained what had happened without exaggerating or omitting. Logan listened in silence, and when she finished, crossed his arms. "So you're telling us that he almost fell because you weren't paying attention?" Deborah controlled herself not to scream. "He was alone because everyone here was busy with anything but him." Logan stepped forward, indignant. "You are paid to watch this boy. You don't need to point fingers at anyone." Peter shrank behind her. "I was quiet, I just wanted to see the garden below." In the late afternoon, Elizabeth arrived with hurried steps, still wearing her uniform. Deborah went down the stairs with Peter at her side, the two holding hands. Seeing his mother's face, the boy ran and threw himself into her arms. Elizabeth hugged him tightly but noticed something strange. "What happened, my love? You're shaking." Deborah approached slowly and calmly told everything that had happened. The tone of her voice was not one of alarm, but of truth. Elizabeth listened to the end without interrupting. Then she raised her eyes and faced her mother, who was just watching from the living room with a glass in her hand. "He almost fell from a veranda, and no one bothered to tell me." Margaret let out a loud sigh. "You're exaggerating as always. The child is in one piece, isn't he?" Logan rose from the sofa, approaching with a hard look. "Are you trying to turn a scare into a scandal?" Elizabeth stepped forward, still holding her son tightly. "The scare could have been a tragedy. He's just a child. He shouldn't be loose around here." Margaret turned her back. "It's not our fault if the boy doesn't know how to behave." Elizabeth raised her voice with eyes full of anger. "It's not him who doesn't know how to behave. It's you who don't know what love is." Peter tightened his arms around her, hiding his face. Logan then turned to Deborah, accusing her directly. "And you, instead of preventing it, you're chatting with his mother, as if you were part of the family. You forget you're here to obey." Deborah, without changing her tone, answered firmly, "I obeyed my heart. And it told me that protecting that child was more important than pleasing any boss." Logan took a deep breath, looking directly at her. "Then you don't need to come back tomorrow. You can pack your things. You're fired." Margaret didn't move, just slowly swirled her glass. Elizabeth turned to him immediately. "You can't do that. She's the only person who took care of my son with respect." Deborah took her apron and walked toward the back room, from where she brought a small bag. Elizabeth followed her. In the hallway, the two stopped for a moment. "I'm sorry about this. You didn't deserve it," said Elizabeth. Deborah looked at her with serenity. "I was already tired of this environment. I endured it for him. Now it's enough." Peter grabbed the hem of her dress and asked in a low voice, "Are you going to disappear forever?" Deborah bent down, touched his face with both hands, and replied, "For now, yes. But one day, if life allows, I'll come back to see you smiling." He nodded with tears in his eyes. Already on the street, Elizabeth walked with Peter beside her. The silence between them lasted until the boy released the first sentence. "She always took better care of me than the others," Elizabeth replied with a choked voice. "I know, son, and I should have listened to you more." The boy looked up. "She said she would come back. Do you think she really will?" Elizabeth didn't answer immediately. She stopped at the corner, crouched down to her son's height and looked deep into his eyes. "If I can one day, I'll bring her close to us." Peter hugged his mother's neck, as if it were his last anchor in that confusion. At the end of the night, already at home, Elizabeth was trying to organize the small kitchen while Peter slept on the couch. The phone rang, and she answered without thinking. On the other end of the line, Deborah spoke with a tired voice. "Sorry to call late. I just wanted to let you know that tomorrow I'll start looking for another job." Elizabeth sat at the table with her head down. "If I could, you would be here early tomorrow." Deborah responded without hesitation. "When that day comes, I'll be waiting. Just take care of him for me." Elizabeth closed her eyes, holding back tears. "I will take care, like I've never taken care before." And the call ended with the weight of everything that was said, without being shouted. In the dimness of the room, Elizabeth looked at her son sleeping, his chest rising and falling slowly. Each breath he took was now the most important mission of her life. No more mistakes could be allowed. The feeling of guilt still lived there, but now shared space with a growing certainty. Something would change. Even if it took time, even if it was difficult. One day this house will be full of good people, she thought. And when that day comes, she will be here. It was just the beginning, but inside her heart there was no longer room to accept contempt as normality. On Tuesday morning, Elizabeth woke up startled by the sound of Peter's dry cough coming from the bedroom. She hurried out of the kitchen, where she was preparing coffee, and ran to the boy. He was huddled under the blanket, his face reddened and his eyes tired. She sat beside him, ran her hand across his forehead and felt the heat rising relentlessly. "You have a fever, son," she said with a distressed voice, trying to disguise the panic forming inside. Peter opened his eyes slowly and murmured, "My throat hurts, and my head too, Mom." Without wasting time, Elizabeth gathered the documents, dressed the boy in warmer clothes and took him to the nearest public hospital. The waiting room was crowded, but she remained firm, holding Peter in her arms when he had no strength to stand. After long hours, a doctor examined the boy and diagnosed bronchitis, explaining that treatment would require rest and specific medications. "These medicines are not available here. You need to buy them at a regular pharmacy," the man said, handing her the prescription. Elizabeth took the paper with trembling hands and read the names carefully. "I'll find a way, son, I always do." Leaving the hospital with her son in her arms, Elizabeth walked through the narrow streets of the neighborhood under the hot sun that now seemed to mock her situation. She passed in front of a pharmacy and entered, handing the prescription to the attendant. After a few minutes, she received the quote. The amount was too high for the little she had saved. "Isn't there a cheaper version of these pills?" she asked, already knowing the answer. The attendant pointed to a shelf, offering a generic version which would still consume almost all the money she had set aside for the week. "If I don't take this, he gets worse," she thought, feeling her stomach turn. As she left the pharmacy, with the bag in hand and a heavy heart, Elizabeth took her cell phone from her purse and took a deep breath. She knew she didn't want to do that, but saw no other way out. She dialed her parents' house number, hoping someone different would answer. Logan's voice emerged from the other end, cold and direct. "What is it now, Elizabeth?" She hesitated for a second, but soon explained the situation. She told about the diagnosis, about the medicines, about the persistent fever. "I just need some help. He's sick and the medicines are expensive." The answer came dry. "We're spending on Brian's wedding. You need to figure it out yourself." Elizabeth remained silent for a few seconds, not knowing whether to hang up or scream. On the other end, Margaret took the phone and spoke in an impatient tone. "This is not the time for this kind of thing. You know how busy everything is here. How about you stop getting into trouble?" The words seemed like darts thrown without any mercy. Elizabeth gripped the phone so hard she thought it would break. "He is your grandson," she said just that, before hearing the click of the call being ended. The silence that followed was louder than any response. "I shouldn't have called. I knew I'd hear this." With the bag in her hands and a lost gaze, Elizabeth walked aimlessly for a few minutes. She tried not to cry in public, but her eyes were already watery. When she passed by the entrance of the neighborhood lottery shop, she stopped. The sign flashed in colorful, eye-catching letters. She never gambled, never had that habit. But at that moment, something inside her asked for a chance. She entered the small space and, with the last bill that was still in her wallet, asked for a ticket. "Give me a random game, anyone," she said to the attendant. She took the ticket carefully as if it were a fragile piece of hope. "If there's any miracle for me, it's now." The way back home was silent, with Peter sleeping in her arms. Elizabeth arrived, put the boy in bed and rushed to prepare tea. She mixed herbs with honey, as she had learned from Deborah. She gave the generic medicine, measured the fever and made compresses to try to relieve it. She sat next to her son and ran her hand through his dark blonde hair. "You'll get better. Mom will do everything right this time." Peter, even still dizzy with fever, managed to open a slight smile. "You're the best mommy in the world," he said with a hoarse voice. Elizabeth held back tears fiercely. "You're all I have." In the kitchen, washing the used mug, Elizabeth looked out the window and saw the empty street. She took the lottery ticket and left it on the table next to the bag of medicines. She sat in front of it, not knowing whether to feel shame or hope. "I don't even know why I did this. These things don't happen to people like me." She rested her elbows on the table and supported her face in her hands. She remained there for long minutes in silence, The wall clock marked time with an irritating tick. But if it happens, I'll never let him go through this again. When night came, Elizabeth prepared a light broth and returned to the bedroom. Peter was calmer, but still breathing tiredly. She sat beside him and began telling simple stories, made up on the spot. She spoke of a place where mothers could solve everything with a snap of their fingers. She spoke of a brave boy who never got sick. She spoke of a home where everything was warm, even in the cold. "Mommy, does this place really exist?" asked Peter with his eyes almost closing. Elizabeth adjusted his blanket and answered in a whisper, "Not yet, but we'll get there." He smiled before falling asleep. In the middle of the night, when the house was plunged into silence, Elizabeth sat again in the kitchen, with the dim light on and the ticket still on the table. She touched it with her fingers as if testing its existence. She thought about what she would do if she won. She thought about paid bills, expensive medicines, a new bed for Peter, hiring Deborah back. She thought about a life where she could breathe without guilt. It's not just for me. It's for him. It's always been for him. She rested her chin on her hands and closed her eyes for a few seconds. But does fate really look at people like us? She didn't know what would come. She had no idea if that piece of paper would bring any different future. But one thing was clear within her. From that day on, she would never again accept hearing that she needed to manage on her own. If the world wanted to continue denying help, she would find a way to win without having to ask for anything. Either I discover a new path or I die trying. I just won't leave him sick along the way. And even exhausted, even with shoulders weighing more than her body, she stood up, looked one last time at Peter sleeping and whispered, "You will never be without ground, as long as I'm here." The days passed quickly. Saturday began with the smell of fresh fruit in the air and the sound of mixed voices echoing between the market stalls. Elizabeth walked slowly between the corridors, holding the cloth bag with one hand and observing the vegetables with the other. She wore simple clothes, her hair tied with a loose elastic, and the fatigue on her face no longer disguised itself. The sky was clear, but inside her everything seemed confused. She sought distraction, but the tightness in her chest wouldn't let her relax. It was then that she heard a familiar voice, low and firm, coming from the corner where herbs and breads were sold. "Do you still make that soup that makes the house smell like a hug?" Elizabeth turned in surprise and saw Deborah there, with a basket on her arm and the same serene countenance. She smiled immediately and approached. The two embraced tightly, as if that time apart had lasted months. "I thought about you all these days," said Elizabeth, pulling her friend to walk together between the stalls. They walked side by side, exchanging quick questions about how things were. Elizabeth told about the medicines, the sleepless nights, and the constant fear. Deborah listened in silence until she stopped in front of a vegetable stand and said, "I heard your father is secretly selling properties. The company is slowly sinking, and he pretends everything is fine." Elizabeth was silent for a few seconds, processing the information. "They pretend well. There was never a lack of posturing in that house," she responded with bitterness. Deborah looked around like someone who doesn't want to draw attention and spoke in a lower tone. "If by chance you win some money with that lottery you've been playing, don't tell them anything. They'll smell it before you even realize." Elizabeth frowned and responded with irony, "I hardly remember playing it. It was just desperation. But if it happens, even I don't know how I would react." Deborah held her arm and firmly added, "Then keep that secret, as if it were your only chance for peace." They spent a few more minutes together, buying small things. The conversation changed to lighter topics, but Elizabeth's eyes always returned to the thought that Deborah had left in the air. When they said goodbye, Elizabeth stood watching her friend walk away down the street. Peter was waiting for her at home, still recovering but with a face already more flushed. Upon arriving, she organized the purchases on the table, checked the thermometer, gave the medicine and prepared lunch. In the middle of the afternoon, while cleaning the kitchen floor, she spotted the lottery ticket held by a magnet on the refrigerator. "The numbers are drawn today. I didn't even remember that." In the early evening, the silence of the house was broken only by the sound of the television that Peter was watching from the bedroom. Elizabeth sat on the sofa with the crumpled piece of paper in her hands. The numbers began to be announced one by one. The first matched, the second as well. The third made her sit up straighter. When all 6 numbers were revealed, she remained completely still. The ticket was right, the numbers were there, the amount was real. For a few seconds, she couldn't move. She looked again, then once more. This is wrong. This can't be happening. But there was no mistake. It was real. She had won. She stood up in shock, walking through the house aimlessly, as if trying to wake up. She entered Peter's room, who was watching cartoons with a blanket over his shoulders. She sat down beside him, holding the ticket against her chest. "Son, I need to tell you something, but you have to promise to keep it a secret, at least for now." Peter looked at her, curious. Elizabeth smiled like she hadn't smiled in a long time and showed him the ticket. "Mommy won. That bet I made on the street, remember? We won, we're millionaires." The boy was confused for a moment, but then broke into a huge smile. "Does that mean we'll have a new bed and good food every day?" Elizabeth held his face with both hands and responded with emotion. "We'll have everything you need, but more than that, no one will tell us what to do anymore." Peter hugged his mother tightly, still not understanding everything. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke. "And the first person I'm going to tell is her, the only one who always took care of you like I did." That same night, Elizabeth picked up the phone and called Deborah. Her friend answered on the 3rd ring with her usual calmness. "Deborah, I won. It's a lot of money. And I want you back with me. This time as a member of the household, not as an employee." Deborah took a few seconds to respond. Her voice came choked with emotion. "Are you serious? Are you telling me that everything has changed now?" Elizabeth laughed through tears. "Everything except my gratitude for you, that will never change." The next day, Elizabeth went to the pharmacy and bought the original medications. She also contacted a local builder and discreetly began a small renovation of the house, starting with the roof and the bathroom. Nothing luxurious, just functional and dignified. Peter watched everything with bright eyes. "Our house is starting to smell like new things, Mommy," he said excitedly. Elizabeth hugged him and replied, "The smell of a fresh start, son." In the late afternoon, they sat at the new kitchen table, which replaced the old cracked wooden one. They ate a hot meal together, with fresh vegetables and freshly made juice. Peter laughed at anything, and Elizabeth just observed him as if trying to preserve every detail of that moment. "Can I write in my story notebook that we got rich?" he asked. Elizabeth looked at him lovingly and answered, "Yes, you can, but write it as if it were our secret. That way no one will try to steal our happy ending." Peter nodded seriously, like a secret agent fulfilling an important mission. Later, when everyone was asleep, Elizabeth walked to the new room that would be Peter's when the renovation was finished. She sat on the floor, still covered with dust, and leaned her back against the wall. She took the ticket from her wallet and looked at the numbers for the 10th time. She thought about what Deborah had said. She knew that her parents, upon discovering, would come after her without hesitation. She knew they would use any excuse to take advantage. But now she was ready. This time, I have a choice, and my choice is to protect my son. She put the ticket in an envelope, placed it in a locked drawer, and returned to the bedroom with a lighter heart. The next morning would be the beginning of a new phase, but Elizabeth knew that each step would have to be silent and calculated. She preferred to wait, to see where fate would take this. For now, she was content with what she saw on Peter's face. He slept peacefully, breathing more easily, without fever, without fear. It was all she needed for now. "You can't even imagine, my love, but your life is changing right now." The mother who once asked for help and was told to figure it out on her own now had in her hands the chance to turn the tables, and she would do it silently, with intelligence, and with her heart in the right place. The afternoon heat came through the newly installed windows of the house under renovation. Elizabeth was sitting on the living room floor with Peter, setting up a small car track on the carpet, still covered with cement dust. The boy, now more energetic, made curves with enthusiasm, laughing at each fictional collision. Between one maneuver and another, he looked at his mother with an expression too serious for a game. "Mum, have grandparents called to check on me?" Elizabeth stopped pushing the cart and took a deep breath. "No, son, they haven't called." Peter lowered his eyes and sighed slowly. "Then maybe they'll only call if you tell them I went away." Elizabeth didn't understand immediately. She leaned against the wall, still holding the cart, and looked at him, trying to process. "What do you mean, went away?" What are you talking about? Peter continued arranging the toy cars as if the subject were as simple as changing lanes. If you tell them I died, maybe they'll stop everything and come running. Then you'll know if they really care. Elizabeth put the toy aside and held her son's arm, staring at him. Son, that's not something you should say, not even as a joke. This is too serious. Peter looked her in the eyes without blinking. What they feel for me is serious too, or it should be. The silence that followed was thick. Elizabeth stood up, walked around the room, went to the kitchen, and came back. She was restless, with her arms crossed and her heart tight. That's too cruel, Peter. We can't do that kind of thing just to test someone. But the boy remained firm, almost calm. Mom, it's just a lie, and they've been lying to you your whole life, you need to know. Elizabeth ran her hand over her face, feeling his words like handfuls of reality thrown without anesthesia. You talk as if you were an adult, but I'm the mother, and I don't know if I can do this with a clear conscience. Throughout the afternoon, doubt hammered in Elizabeth's mind. She walked from one room to another, pretending to look for something, but what she was really seeking was courage. Peter, in his room, drew in silence, without pressing the matter further. Her long consideration was answer enough. When the clock passed 5, she sat on the bed and stared at her cell phone for long minutes. She thought about what Deborah would say. She thought about what Logan and Margaret had said at the hospital. She thought about all the times she had reached out to them and been ignored. If I do this, there's no going back. It will be the ugliest moment of my life, but perhaps the clearest. In the early evening, Elizabeth put Peter in the bath, prepared a hot soup, and left him in his pajamas watching television. Then she went to the bedroom, sat in front of the phone, and took a deep breath. It was Saturday. Brian's wedding celebration would be that day, and she knew her parents would be there. It was the exact moment for the truth of the test to happen. She took her cell phone, scrolled through the contacts, and pressed her father's name. Her heart raced, her breathing faltered for a moment. She heard 3 rings before the call was answered. Logan's voice emerged muffled, with music in the background. Elizabeth, now is not a good time. She pressed the device against her ear and forced her voice to sound choked up. Dad, I only called because... Joe's Peter. He didn't make it. He had a respiratory crisis and died this morning. On the other end, a brief silence, then just an impatient sigh. I'm very sorry, but I can't talk now. We're in the middle of Brian's ceremony. We'll talk later. And he hung up. Elizabeth remained with the cell phone glued to her ear for a few more seconds, hearing only nothing. He hung up. He simply hung up, as if I had told him the oven burned dinner. Still in shock, Elizabeth called again, this time to Margaret. Her mother answered with an affected voice, as if she were part of a rehearsed play. You called just now. Is everything okay? Elizabeth repeated the phrase, almost lifeless. Peter died, Mum. It was this morning. I just thought I should let you know. The answer came without hesitation. That's a shame, but we're at the reception now. Call us later, or when you can, send us a message. And the final click of the call cut through the silence like an invisible razor. Elizabeth let the cell phone fall onto the bed, her hands trembling and her face expressionless. For a few minutes she couldn't move. She stayed there, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of the lie that was becoming a scream of truth. They didn't care. They felt no pain. They felt nothing. This was no longer a doubt. It was a fact. A painful portrait painted with her parents' cold words. Elizabeth got up, walked to the living room, and saw Peter watching some cartoon. She sat next to him, saying nothing, and he just looked at her face. Did they believe it? He asked. She nodded. They believed it. And they said they'll talk to me later. Because today is a day of celebration. Peter rested his head on her shoulder and remained silent. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't apologize for the idea. He just stayed there, quiet. Elizabeth, for her part, let the tears fall slowly. They weren't tears of guilt. They were from a grief she had been living with for years, even with her son alive by her side. It was the pain of having parents who were dead to empathy. The worst absence is when the person is alive and yet doesn't show up. And with that certainty, she understood that everything would change from then on. They had proven with each cold word that they no longer deserved any space in her life. At the end of the night, Elizabeth deleted all the old messages from her phone, including her parents' numbers. She put the lottery ticket back in the drawer and locked it. She prepared a tea and took it to Peter, who had already brushed his teeth and was getting ready to sleep. She sat beside the bed, handed him the mug and ran her hand through his hair. "We don't choose the family we're born into, but we can choose the one that stays," she said quietly. Peter looked at her with a slight smile and replied, "I already chose a long time ago. I chose you." And so, between the invented truth and the revealing lie, mother and son slept closer than ever. The sound of hammers had given way to the smell of fresh paint, and the old simple house was now beginning to take on the contours of definitive coziness. Elizabeth walked across the new living room floor, testing the creaks and smiling discreetly. The light-colored walls reflected a different light, and the kitchen already showed the first signs of a well-done renovation. Deborah appeared through the back door with a bucket and cleaning cloths, and Peter followed her with a colorful feather duster, laughing at each of the employees' commands. "He thinks cleaning is a game," said Elizabeth, leaning against the doorframe. "Isn't it?" replied Deborah, winking at the boy. Peter raised the duster as if it were a trophy. "Everything is more fun here. Even the dust seems to want to go away." That Saturday morning, the harmony of the house was visible. The relationship between Elizabeth and Deborah was no longer just professional, but almost familial. They shared looks of complicity, divided tasks, and, in silence, healed wounds. Peter constantly approached Deborah, offering help or just making conversation, like someone seeking security in simple gestures. "Did you know that if you put a wooden spoon on top of the pot, the milk won't spill over?" he asked, proud. Deborah smiled while stirring a tea on the stove. "Yes, I do, and I also know that a curious boy like you will grow up smarter than many adults out there." On the other side of town, inside a dimly lit and silent room, Logan examined the computer screen with half-closed eyes. There were red numbers where there used to be profits. The columns accumulated losses, and the graphs displayed curves that only went down. Margaret entered with a glass of juice and looked over his shoulder. "Any improvement?" she asked with boredom. Logan answered without taking his eyes off the screen. "The situation is more serious than I imagined. I sold 2 plots of land this week and still lack capital to pay off suppliers." Margaret sat in the armchair next to him and said with contained irritation, "That story about Elizabeth, do you think she received something with the boy's death?" Logan put the glass on the table, cleaned his glasses with a handkerchief and crossed his arms. "There's a family insurance policy. It was taken out years ago when she still lived with us. If we didn't cancel it, it may have been paid automatically." Margaret straightened her posture, interested for the first time in days. "And if she received it? Do you think it was a lot?" Logan replied without hesitation. "Enough to justify a visit." Margaret remained silent for a few seconds. Then she stood up, picked up her purse from the table, and looked at her husband. "Then let's go today. Better to show some sadness before she decides to spend it all without thinking about family." Meanwhile, on the new porch of the house, Elizabeth was watering some herb seedlings that Peter had helped plant 2 days before. The boy sat on a newly installed wooden bench and observed the movement on the street. Deborah came out of the kitchen with a towel and a bread basket. "Today we have coffee with warm cake, lady of the house," she said with humor, placing everything on the table. Elizabeth approached, smelled the still warm bread and smiled. "You know what's funny? Even with money, the best part of my life now isn't what I bought," Deborah replied, sitting down. "Sometimes freedom is what we build when we stop asking for permission." Minutes later, as they were putting the dishes in the sink, they heard 2 dry knocks on the door. Elizabeth walked to it unhurriedly, but stopped when she peeked through the curtain. Outside, Logan and Margaret stood side by side, neat, with faces controlled by rehearsed expressions. She took a deep breath before opening. "What a surprise. I thought you were too busy for visits." Margaret tried to smile. "We thought you needed support at this time." Logan added, "May we come in?" Elizabeth didn't respond immediately. She just made space and took a step back, letting them enter in silence. If the support came now, it took quite a while to find its way. The house caused an immediate impact. Margaret looked around and noticed the changes. Logan observed the new furniture and painted walls. "I see you've renovated," he said with a tone of suspicion. Elizabeth crossed her arms. "The house needed it. You learn to take care of yourself when no one else offers help." Margaret looked around, unsure whether to compliment or criticize. It's different. More. Clean. Elizabeth gave a half smile. Here, even the dirt knows its place. Peter appeared in the hallway, but upon seeing his grandparents, returned to his room without saying anything. Elizabeth noticed. Your absence marked more than any forced presence. Logan cleared his throat and sat on the edge of the chair. Elizabeth, we know this is a difficult time, and there's a tradition in our family, something called child life insurance. Margaret nodded, crossing her legs. It's an automatic procedure. You must have received something. Elizabeth feigned surprise and walked to the bookshelf. She took a thin envelope and returned with slow steps. She firmly placed the paper on the table. This is the only paper that matters now. Margaret took the note and looked at the numbers carefully. Logan read over her shoulder. Both their expressions changed in seconds. Their eyes widened. Their hands trembled slightly. Is this real? Logan asked. Elizabeth responded calmly. As real as your absence when I needed you most. Before they could say anything else, Peter appeared again and stood beside his mother. Margaret stepped forward with outstretched arms. Peter, you're alive? The boy just stared at her without moving. Logan approached and tried to smile. Was this a misunderstanding? Elizabeth interrupted, crossing her arms again. It was a test. A cruel test, I know, but necessary. I needed to know if you cared. Margaret tried to justify herself. It was the wedding. Everything was happening. It was an inappropriate moment. Logan just stared at the note. You lied to us? Elizabeth raised her face. And you lied to me for an entire lifetime. Deborah appeared in the kitchen doorway, still holding a cloth in her hands. Margaret recognized her immediately and made a face of disapproval. You're working here? Deborah smiled slightly and answered without hesitation. Now, I work where I'm well treated. Logan turned to Elizabeth, visibly uncomfortable. You can accuse us of whatever you want, but don't think you can keep us from what's rightfully ours. Elizabeth moved closer and looked him in the eyes. The only thing that's yours now is the exit door. Margaret grabbed her husband's arm and whispered angrily, She's going to throw everything away because of resentment? Elizabeth then said firmly, It's not resentment, it's justice. The two left the house without saying anything more, still holding the note, but not understanding how everything had escaped control so quickly. Elizabeth remained standing in the hallway, feeling her body tremble inside, but steady outside. Deborah approached, placing her hand on her shoulder. You did what you had to do. Now they know that no one gives orders here anymore. Elizabeth took a deep breath and looked at Peter, who was smiling discreetly. Now they know. And now they know they've lost their last chance to be part of this. The boy approached and said, We won, Mum. Elizabeth smiled and responded, We won without having to step on anyone. And at that moment the house seemed more alive than ever. The pot released a warm aroma of sautéed garlic, while Elizabeth slowly stirred with a wooden spoon, attentive to the rice's cooking point. Deborah, seated at the table, flipped through the day's newspaper with a furrowed brow. The headline displayed in large letters the news of the official bankruptcy of Logan's company. Above the title, an old image of the factory facade, and below testimonials from former female employees about excessive hours, irregular contracts, and moral harassment. Deborah read aloud with a tone of bitter disbelief. The day has come. The empire of pride has collapsed from within. Elizabeth turned off the heat, covered the pot, and took a deep breath. They always ignored what really hurt people. The newspaper fell folded on the table as Deborah crossed her arms. You should report them. There are things here only you can confirm. This can't go unpunished. Elizabeth sat across from her with a plate in hand and thought for a moment. The truth has already come to light. I don't need to prove anything anymore. What's happening is the only regret they understand. Losing everything. Deborah observed her carefully. You've always been calmer than me. I would have made noise. Elizabeth took a spoonful of rice and responded simply. They always shouted. I chose to be silent to have peace. In the backyard, Peter ran with a pencil in hand and sheets attached to an improvised clipboard. He was barefoot, laughing to himself while drawing on the wooden bench under the shade. Elizabeth spied on him through the window with the corner of her eyes. When he finished lunch, he came into the kitchen with the paper in his hands and a glow on his face. I made something for you, Mum. He handed her the drawing. 3 people were holding hands in front of a house with blue windows and a huge sun in the corner of the page. Elizabeth held the paper fondly. Who are these 3 people? Peter answered with a calm smile. You, me, and the lady from the kitchen. Elizabeth ran her fingers over the colorful scribbles and sighed with emotion. Is this your new family? She asked. Peter nodded firmly. It's the one that really sees me. Deborah approached, looking at the drawing over her friend's shoulder. This is worth more than any document. This house now has a soul. Elizabeth placed the paper on the refrigerator and secured it with an old magnet. If we know how to keep this drawing true, everything else will work out. Peter ran back to the backyard, and they returned to the kitchen with eyes fuller than their mouths. In the middle of the afternoon, someone knocked on the door with a discreet touch. Elizabeth walked to the entrance and, upon opening it, came face to face with Brian. He was alone with an expression somewhere between shame and regret. He carried only his hands in his pockets and evident weariness in his gaze. Do you have time? He asked. Elizabeth hesitated for a second, but made room for him to enter. The house is different, he said, looking around. Life too, she replied, leading him to the living room. They sat facing each other, and the silence lasted until he released the first sentence. I didn't know. Really. I never knew how you were treated. Elizabeth rested her elbows on her knees and spoke calmly. You didn't know because you never lacked anything. Life spared you from what hit me. Brian lowered his head, fidgeting nervously with his hands. I only saw what they showed me. I thought you were distant because you wanted to be. She looked at him with a mixture of pain and serenity. I wanted to exist, but in that house there was only room for 1 star at a time. Peter entered the room slowly and observed the two. Elizabeth called him with a gesture. Son, this is your uncle. The boy stood before Brian, looked for a few seconds and said, You look tired, want to sit here with me? Brian smiled sincerely for the first time that day. He sat down next to his nephew, and they began to talk about toy cars, drawings, and chocolate cake. Elizabeth watched from a distance, allowing that new bridge to be built with simple words. He's smart, isn't he? Said Brian. Elizabeth nodded with a slight smile. More than I deserve. Deborah from the kitchen piqued with curiosity, but respected the distance. Peter then held his uncle's hand and said sweetly, You can come more often if you want. Here we share the bench. Elizabeth blinked discreetly, seeing there the beginning of a new story. Meanwhile, in a modest and disorganized house on the other side of town, Logan dragged a chair near the window, observing the street movement with irritation. The new dwelling was cramped, poorly lit, and each room seemed to scream what they had lost. Margaret walked back and forth with a crumpled newspaper in her hands. If they had listened to my advice, none of this would have happened, she repeated. Logan snapped his fingers, impatient. If you hadn't insisted on keeping up appearances, perhaps we would still have our contracts in order. The discussion continued cyclically, without end or solution. She must be laughing at us now, Margaret said bitterly. Logan rose abruptly, went to the kitchen and opened a drawer forcefully. She will still pay for this. I don't accept being set aside as if I were trash. Margaret leaned back on the sofa and replied with disdain, You were set aside because you only look at your own pocket. On the other side of town, Elizabeth received an unexpected call. The publisher of the children's book that Peter had drawn had shown interest in transforming the story into a project with social purposes. The proposal was to publish it with illustrations made by him and direct all profits to institutions that cared for neglected children. We want something real. And there's nothing more real than what you've lived through, said the voice on the other end. Elizabeth moved, walked to the room where Peter was drawing another of his ideas. She sat down beside him and told him the news. They want to turn your story into a book, and everything will help children like you who have felt alone. Peter dropped his pencil, opened a wide smile and ran to the kitchen to tell Deborah the news. We're going to help a lot of kids that nobody sees, he shouted. Deborah took him in her arms and turned slowly, with teary eyes. Your story will become a seed for those who haven't found a way out yet. Elizabeth observed everything, with a heart full of gratitude. As night fell, Margaret walked alone on the sidewalk in a distant neighborhood, with slow steps and a lost gaze. Turning a corner, she spotted her daughter's renovated house in the distance. She stopped in front of the gate without courage to ring the doorbell. She saw lights on, heard laughter coming from inside. She stood there for a few minutes, as if waiting to be noticed. Elizabeth from inside passed by the window and saw her. Their eyes met for a second. Margaret rehearsed a gesture, but said nothing. Elizabeth simply closed the curtain calmly and turned back inside. Some walls are built from the outside. Others rise within us. That night, Elizabeth's house was full of laughter, colorful drawings, and the smell of home-cooked food. Brian was still there, talking with Peter. Deborah was preparing dessert, and the new routine was beginning to take shape without anyone having to force anything. Outside, the past knocked on doors that would no longer open. Elizabeth knew there would still be challenges, but there in that moment all that mattered was under the same roof. Family is who remains even when the world collapses. And here, finally, we have solid ground to walk on. And with that certainty, she moved forward, determined never to retreat again. 2 months had passed since the publisher knocked on the door with the unexpected proposal, and since then, everything around Elizabeth had transformed in a silent and irreversible way. The book cover with Peter's name stamped next to the drawing of a house with 3 people holding hands was everywhere. In bookstore windows, on posters in schools, in colorful literary fair bags. The title had been chosen by him, with large, simple letters. Sitting at the table in the living room, Elizabeth organized event invitations and read letters from children in other cities, while Peter, lying on the sofa, drew new ideas. "Mum, in the next story, the boy will live in a house that talks to him," he said excitedly. Elizabeth smiled, holding an envelope with illustrations made by students. "I think that house will have more heart than many adults out there." The house was different, not just because of the completed renovations, but because of the atmosphere that occupied every corner. Laughter frequently filled the corridors, and the windows were always open, letting in the sound of the street, the smell of lunch, and real life. Brian came almost every day. He helped with shopping, painting walls, and sometimes just sat on the sofa to listen. That constant presence that was once absent now made a difference. One morning, while painting a bench in the yard, Peter said, "Uncle, I like when you come, because it seems like we're real." Brian lowered his brush, ran his hand through the boy's hair and replied, "It's because now we are for real." Deborah also flourished during this time. More active, with colorful clothes and firm steps, she had taken the lead in small activities with the neighborhood children. She organized storytelling in the yard, invented workshops with cardboard, and began teaching simple recipes to the little ones. Peter was the most excited among them all, running from one side to the other with his drawings, commanding the fun as if he were the owner of the new season. Elizabeth watched from the window, with crossed arms and a light heart. "I never imagined that the sound of joy would be so silently powerful," she murmured. Deborah, upon hearing, replied without looking back, "It's because it doesn't come from the throat, it comes from the soul." The invitations to events increased each week. Schools asked for Elizabeth's presence to talk about overcoming challenges. Teachers wanted Peter to explain how his ideas came about, and libraries organized reading circles based on his stories. One morning, arriving from one of these visits, Elizabeth put her bags on the kitchen floor and sat down with a sigh. They asked how I endured all that without falling apart. Peter approached, already barefoot, with an apple in his hand. "And what did you say?" Elizabeth smiled and replied, "I said that when we have someone to hold our hand, the size of the fall doesn't matter." The nights changed too. Once silent and tired, they were now filled with readings, plans, and conversations about next steps. Peter started a new notebook with his ideas, scribbling characters and scenes as if he already knew where everything would lead. Brian helped type the text on the computer, and Deborah sewed fabric covers to store the printed copies at home. On one of these nights, Peter showed a new sketch with 4 people in front of the house. Elizabeth frowned. "4?" she asked. He smiled. "It's because now Uncle is also part of it, even if he arrived later." Brian looked at the paper, then at his sister, and said in a low voice, "I think now I'm finally in the right place." Even with a routine full of commitments, Elizabeth found time for intimate moments with Peter. One afternoon, sitting under the tree in the backyard, she commented on everything that had changed. "Do you remember when it was just the 2 of us, hidden from the world?" Peter nodded, laying his head on her lap. Now it seems like the world has discovered we exist. Elizabeth stroked his hair calmly and replied, "Sometimes the absence of those who hurt us is the most valuable gift we can receive." Peter looked up at her and spoke firmly. "I don't miss anyone, Mom. Those who never truly cared don't deserve to be missed." The memories of the past were still there, but they no longer hurt the same way. They were like marks on a cleared ground, where new seeds were beginning to grow. Deborah organized a mural with photos of the most important moments. The day of the first book, the first school presentation, the publisher's visit. Peter carefully glued everything, smiling at each image. "This one is when you were nervous before speaking to a bunch of people," he said, pointing to a photo of Elizabeth holding the microphone with trembling hands. She laughed when she saw it. "And you in the background, making faces with your nose." Peter shrugged. "I knew you could handle it. I always knew." On the other side of town, nothing was flourishing. Logan spent his afternoon sitting in the same chair, leafing through old papers and mumbling about possibilities that would never return. Margaret, less haughty, went out for long, silent walks. During one of these wanderings, she stopped in front of her daughter's house, observing the movement in the yard. She saw children playing, heard laughter, smelled bread coming from the oven. For a moment, she held the gate but didn't have the courage to push it. Elizabeth, who was watering the plants, noticed her mother's presence across the street. For a second, their eyes met. Margaret opened her mouth, perhaps to say something, but Elizabeth simply went inside and closed the door calmly. Some people only learn through absence, and even then, they still choose silence. That same night, after dinner, Peter asked to share a new story he had written. He climbed onto a small stool in the living room, held the folded papers and began to read. He told of a boy who one day became invisible, but later realized he could be a giant just by existing. Elizabeth listened in silence, her eyes fixed on her son, feeling proud of every word. Deborah discreetly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Brian filmed the scene with his phone, trying not to laugh when Peter invented words in the middle of the text. When he finished, the boy stepped down from the stool and looked at the three of them. "This story is ours too, because nobody grows alone." Elizabeth hugged him tightly, whispering, "And nobody writes a new life without erasing the wrong names from the beginning." The sun streamed through the cracks of the porch, while Peter ran around the yard with other children, shouting the names of characters he had created himself. Deborah, sitting near the flower bed, watched with calm eyes and hands folded on her lap. The children's laughter echoed like a reminder that this space was now free, light and genuine. Elizabeth, standing by the window, observed in silence. "Everything began to change when I stopped waiting for those who never came," she murmured to herself, touching the glass with her fingertips. The house was now alive and no longer needed anyone's approval. Brian arrived shortly after with a bag of sweets and bread, receiving Peter's excited hugs before even taking off his shoes. They all sat around the outdoor table, exchanging laughs and plans, while the smell of cake in the oven completed the scene of happy simplicity. Deborah passed a plate to Elizabeth and said, smiling, "You created all this, not with money, but with decision." Elizabeth replied firmly, "I just learned that depending on those who hurt us is like planting in dry ground." Peter pulled his uncle by the arm and showed him a new drawing. "This is the continuation of our story," he said proudly. Later, the television showed a brief report about bankrupt business people. Among the images, Logan and Margaret appeared briefly, pale, surrounded by old furniture and piles of overdue bills. Deborah turned down the volume and looked at Elizabeth. She, serene, just took a sip of tea and responded, "Everyone learns from what they value. They only understood when they lost what they always placed above everything else." Brian remained silent, staring at the screen for a moment, before smiling again at his nephew. In the yard, the children's voices continued. Peter ran to his mother and threw himself into her lap. "Mom, we're going to write more books, right?" Elizabeth hugged him tightly, caressing his hair. "Yes, my love, because whoever finds their own voice never again needs the silence of others." Deborah approached with a cloth in her hands, and Brian brought more tea. There was no more rush, no more fear, just the certainty that after everything, home existed there. Did you enjoy Elizabeth and Peter's story? Then subscribe to the channel, comment which city you're watching this beautiful story from. Leave your like and check out the next one waiting for you on screen. See you there. "Sir, will you buy my brother? He is going to die," said a little beggar girl to a millionaire who ignored her. Days later, the millionaire was shocked to discover what had happened to them. The dark sky poured a relentless rain over the city, as if even the heavens were crying for the fate of Piper and her little brother Jasper. Since losing their parents, the streets had become their only home, a cruel and indifferent place for two children alone in the world. Piper, with her dark hair stuck to her face by the rain, carried Jasper in her thin arms, feeling the abnormal heat emanating from her brother's fragile body. Her large brown eyes were red from crying, but she couldn't give up. She was the only person Jasper had in the world. "Hold on just a little longer, Jasper," she whispered against her brother's wet hair, feeling his chest rise and fall with difficulty with each breath. "I promise, I'll get help." The rain fell harder and harder, making Piper seek shelter under the awning of a closed shop. Her clothes, a faded dress torn at the edges, were soaked and heavy. Jasper coughed violently in her arms, a sound that tore at his sister's heart. Each cough seemed to tear away a piece of the boy's life force. His round face, normally cheerful and smiling, was now pale and downcast, with lips almost blue from cold. The fever that had been consuming him for days now seemed to boil his little body, and Piper didn't know what else to do. People passed quickly on the sidewalk, some with umbrellas, others protecting themselves as best they could from the storm. But none even glanced at the two abandoned children. "Please, sir. Mom." "Someone." Piper tried to get the attention of passers-by, her voice almost disappearing in the noise of the rain. "My brother is sick. We need help." Desperation grew inside Piper like a dark wave. For days Jasper had been getting worse, his cough becoming deeper, his fever higher, and now he could barely keep his eyes open. She had tried everything: wet cloths on his forehead to bring down the fever, teas made with herbs she could find, even lullabies her mother used to sing. Nothing worked. With each passing hour, Jasper grew weaker, more distant. Piper looked around, tears mixing with the rain streaming down her face. The city lights shone in the distance, cruel in their indifference, while Jasper trembled violently in her arms, his small body fighting against the disease consuming him. "I won't let you go," promised Piper, pressing Jasper against her chest, as if she could transfer her own strength to him. "You're all I have in this world." It was then that Piper saw through the curtain of rain a long gleaming car stopping in front of an illuminated restaurant across the street. The restaurant light seemed warm and welcoming, a cruel contrast to the cold darkness where she and Jasper found themselves. From the car emerged a tall man, dressed in elegant clothes and protected by an umbrella, held by another man in a dark suit. Something in the first man's posture, in the way people around seemed to notice him, told Piper he was important, that he had power, that he could be the answer to her prayers. With Jasper firmly in her arms, she gathered the last of her strength and ran across the street, ignoring the cars that honked and braked sharply. "It's our last hope," thought Piper, feeling Jasper's weight increase with each step. "It has to work." The man was Sterling, known in the city for his business empire and calculating coldness. His angular, well-shaven face showed no emotion as he prepared to enter the restaurant, where a business dinner awaited him. For him, that night was just another in his routine of accumulating power and wealth, indifferent to the storm punishing the less fortunate. Piper managed to reach him before he entered, her little legs trembling with exhaustion, her heart beating erratically in her chest. She stopped before him, a small, drenched figure carrying a precious burden that seemed too large for her fragile arms. "Sir, please." Her voice was trembling but determined. "You look like an important person. Can you help us?" Sterling looked down and saw the soaked girl, hair stuck to her face, eyes pleading, and the small body of the boy in her arms, notably motionless except for occasional tremors and difficult breathing. For a moment, just a brief instant, something seemed to change in his eyes. A distant memory, perhaps, a momentary human connection. Whatever it was, it quickly disappeared, replaced by impatience and irritation. He had an important dinner, important people to impress, profitable business to close. He had no time to get involved with the problems of two street children. His bodyguard stepped forward, as if to push Piper away, but she stood firm, determination shining in her feverish eyes. "Sir, By my brother? He's going to die." The words came out of her mouth in an act of pure desperation. "I'll wash your house, tend to your garden, do anything. I just need money for his medicine." Piper's words hung in the air between them, laden with a desperation that Sterling chose to ignore. He looked at her not as a child desperately in need of help, but as an annoyance, an unwanted stain on his perfect evening. His cold eyes scanned Piper's small, wet figure and Jasper's almost lifeless body in her arms. For a moment, she thought she saw something, compassion perhaps, cross his face, but it was quickly replaced by a mask of disdain. Sterling adjusted the cuff of his expensive shirt and looked at his gold watch, as if the time spent looking at the children was already too much of a waste. The rain continued to fall mercilessly, soaking Piper and Jasper even more, while Sterling remained protected under the umbrella held by his bodyguard. "Get out of my way," he finally said, with a voice as cold as the falling rain. "There are institutions for people like you. Don't bother me." Piper's heart sank at hearing the cruel words. Every day on the streets she had faced rejection and indifference, but something in Sterling's calculated coldness wounded her deeply. How could someone look at a dying child and simply not care? She stepped forward, determined to try once more, but Sterling's bodyguard moved with surprising quickness. The bodyguard made a move to push her away, and Piper lost her balance on the wet sidewalk, desperately trying to protect Jasper as she fell. Time seemed to slow down as she fell backward, feeling Jasper's weight slip from her arms. The impact with the ground was painful, but nothing compared to the pain of seeing her brother falling into a large puddle of dirty water at the edge of the street, his small body producing a splash that made the water soil his already wet clothes even more. "Jasper!" Piper screamed, her voice tearing through the night air. "No, please, no!" Time froze in that terrible moment. Piper, fallen on the wet ground, saw Sterling turn his back on her without even a glance to check if the children were okay. He entered the restaurant with firm steps, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just ignored a child's desperate plea to save her brother's life. The bodyguard followed him, closing the umbrella and letting the raindrops fall on the red carpet at the restaurant entrance. The elegant doors closed behind them, isolating Sterling's comfortable and luxurious world from the desperation he had left behind. Piper dragged herself across the wet sidewalk, ignoring the pain in her scraped knees and elbows from the fall. All that mattered was reaching Jasper, who lay motionless in the puddle of water, his skin now paler than ever against the darkness of the rainy night. "Jasper, please wake up," Piper begged, finally reaching her brother and pulling him out of the water. "Jasper, don't leave me alone in this world, please. Talk to me." With trembling hands, Piper lifted Jasper's body, feeling his dead weight in her arms. Her heart was beating so hard it seemed to want to escape from her chest. Jasper's face was completely pale. His lips had a frightening bluish coloration. She shook him gently, then more forcefully calling his name between desperate sobs. The rain continued to fall relentlessly upon the two, as if the universe was indifferent to the drama unfolding on that dark sidewalk. Piper pressed her ear against her brother's chest, trying to hear his heartbeat through the noise of the storm. For a terrible moment, she couldn't hear anything, and an anguished cry escaped her throat. Then, almost imperceptible, a weak movement of Jasper's chest, a breath so shallow it was barely noticeable. "He's alive." "He's still alive," she murmured, tears of relief mixing with those of the rain. But for how much longer? The question hung in the air unanswered, as Piper looked desperately around, seeking help, some sign of hope. Through the restaurant windows, she could see Sterling sitting comfortably, laughing and talking with other well-dressed people, completely oblivious to the drama happening outside. The contrast was too painful to bear. Inside, warmth, food, comfort, indifference. Outside, cold, hunger, despair, brotherly love. With a determination born of the purest desperation, Piper lifted Jasper once again in her arms. He was heavier now, his consciousness completely absent, his body surrendered to the disease that was consuming him. But Piper couldn't give up, would not give up. With Jasper in her arms, she began to walk down the street, her legs faltering with each step, the rain punishing their fragile bodies. Where she was going, she wasn't exactly sure. She only knew she needed to find help before it was too late. "I'll save you, Jasper," she promised, her words almost inaudible under the storm. "Even if it's the last thing I do in this life." The city lights shone in the distance, distorted by the curtain of rain, as Piper stumbled down the street with Jasper in her arms. Her small body faced the immense effort of carrying her brother, but her will was much greater than her physical strength. Each step was a battle against exhaustion, against the despair that threatened to consume her. Jasper now responded to no stimulus. His body was completely inert, as if he had already given up fighting. But Piper refused to accept this possibility. In her mind flashed memories of better days. Jasper laughing as he ran through the park, his eyes shining when they got a piece of fresh bread, the way he always smiled even in the most difficult moments. These fragments of happiness amid misery were what gave Piper strength to continue, to face one more step, one more second in that desperate fight for her brother's life. "Remember when Mom used to sing us to sleep?" she whispered to Jasper, as if he could hear her. "I'll sing to you when we're safe, I promise. Just don't go away, please." Jasper's silence was the most terrifying response Piper could receive. He always responded, always had a kind word or a smile for her. Now only silence and a breath so weak it seemed almost non-existent. A few meters ahead, Piper spotted the lights of a public hospital, a beacon of hope in the storm that was her life. With the last strength she could gather, she quickened her pace, ignoring the pain in her muscles, the exhaustion that took over every inch of her body. The hospital entrance seemed to be miles away, though in reality it was only a few meters. Each step was a battle, each breath a struggle. When she finally reached the glass doors of the emergency room, her legs gave way, and she fell to her knees on the cold floor, still holding Jasper with all the strength she had left. "Help, please," she shouted with what remained of her voice. "My brother. He's not breathing. Please, someone help." The fluorescent lights of the hospital illuminated the faces of the two children like a cruel spotlight, revealing the full extent of the despair in which they found themselves. Piper's face was contorted with pain and worry, her eyes begging for help from anyone who looked in her direction. Jasper, in contrast, seemed strangely at peace, his face motionless, expressionless, as if he were already far away. A security guard approached, initially with a stern expression, ready to expel two more beggars seeking shelter from the rain. But something in Piper's gaze, in Jasper's frightening immobility, made him hesitate. A nurse passed by hurriedly, but stopped immediately upon seeing the children. Piper felt gentle hands trying to take Jasper from her arms, but she instinctively resisted, clinging to her brother as if her own life depended on it. "He's all I have," she murmured between sobs, reluctant to release Jasper even to those who could help him. "Please save him. He's just a child. He deserves to live." The waiting room of the public hospital buzzed with activity, even at that hour of the night. People moaned in worn plastic chairs, some coughing, others holding injured limbs, all with expressions of pain and anxiety. The air carried a strong smell of disinfectant, mixed with the unmistakable odor of disease and despair. Piper remained kneeling at the entrance, soaked by the rain that still dripped from her clothes and hair, forming a small puddle on the linoleum floor. Jasper remained motionless in her arms, his chest rising and falling at increasingly long and worrying intervals. A security guard in a dark blue uniform approached quickly, his face hardened by the routine of dealing with difficult situations night after night. "Girl, you can't stay here. Where are your parents?" "Unaccompanied children cannot enter without a responsible adult," he said in a firm voice, but not completely devoid of compassion. "This is not a place for street children looking for shelter from the rain." Piper raised her face marked by tears, her eyes conveying a desperation that words could not express. She hugged Jasper tighter, as if fearing someone might tear him from her arms, the only family she had left in the world. The hospital's fluorescent lights seemed merciless, revealing Jasper's extreme pallor and his lips that were already turning purple. Every passing second was precious. Every moment of hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. Piper took a deep breath, gathering strength she didn't know she still possessed. "Please, sir, my brother is very sick. He's dying," Piper begged, her voice choked with tears and exhaustion. "I have no one else in the world besides him. If you send us away, he'll die out there alone in the rain. Please have mercy." The security guard hesitated, his gaze alternating between the rules he should follow and the obvious emergency before him. His expression softened a bit upon seeing the boy's critical condition, but years of work had taught him to follow protocols. He opened his mouth to respond when a middle-aged nurse hurriedly passed through the corridor. She stopped abruptly upon seeing the scene, a soaked girl holding an almost unconscious boy, begging for help while the security guard seemed about to send them away. The nurse approached quickly, her experienced eyes assessing the situation in seconds. She knelt beside Piper, ignoring the water soaking her white uniform, and touched Jasper's forehead, withdrawing her hand almost immediately, alarmed by the intense heat emanating from the small body. "This boy needs urgent care," she declared, already signaling to other staff members. "The fever is extremely high and his breathing is compromised. We need to take him to emergency right now." Everything happened very quickly after that. Jasper was placed on a stretcher by gentle but efficient hands, while Piper tried to keep up, her legs stumbling with fatigue. The medical team moved urgently through the corridors, the stretcher sliding rapidly across the floor, while medical terms that Piper didn't understand were exchanged over her brother's motionless body. For a terrible moment, she feared they would separate them, that they would leave her behind while taking Jasper away, but the nurse who had interceded held her hand, allowing her to accompany her brother. A room with equipment was quickly reached, and Jasper was transferred to a bed, surrounded by beeping machines and doctors speaking rapidly. Piper was kept at the door, watching with eyes widened by fear as they connected tubes and wires to her brother's small body. She had never felt so helpless in her entire life. Are they hurting him? Why are they putting all those things on him? Piper asked the nurse, her hands squeezing the wet fabric of her dress. "He looks so small amid all those machines. He'll be all right, won't he?" After what seemed like an eternity, but was only a few minutes of intense medical activity, a gray-haired doctor with a compassionate look approached Piper. Her badge identified her as Dr. Sinclair. She bent down to be at Piper's eye level, a kindness the girl rarely experienced from adults. The doctor had wrinkles around her eyes that spoke of years of service, of lives saved and lost, of battles against time and disease. Her hands, when they held Piper's, were firm and warm. "Your brother is very sick, little one," said Dr. Sinclair, her voice gentle but not hiding the gravity of the situation. "He has severe pneumonia, a serious infection in his lungs. We're doing everything we can, but he needs a specific medication that unfortunately we don't have available here. Without this medication in the next few hours, I don't know if he'll be able to resist. The infection is very aggressive, and his body is already weakened by exposure and malnutrition." The words hit Piper like physical blows, each one more painful than the last. Pneumonia, specific medication, not available. Don't know if he'll resist. The room seemed to spin around her, the lights becoming brighter and then darker, as she struggled to process what she was hearing. Her childish mind, already overwhelmed by months of surviving on the streets and the premature responsibility of caring for her brother, desperately tried to find a solution, a way out of this nightmare. Dr. Sinclair continued talking, explaining about antibiotics, resistance, hospital pharmacies, but all Piper could understand was that her brother would die if she couldn't get that medication. "How much does this medicine cost, doctor?" "I can work to get the money," offered Piper, determination shining through her fatigue. "I can clean the entire hospital. I can take care of other patients. I can do anything. Just tell me how much I need to get to save my brother." The doctor hesitated, clearly moved by the courage of the little girl before her. She explained that the medication cost more than Piper could earn in months of work, even if it were legal to employ a child her age. She informed her that they would try to contact other health facilities to check the availability of the medicine, but they couldn't promise anything. Meanwhile, they would do their best with the available resources. Piper was led back to the waiting room after the nurse helped her dry off a bit with paper towels and offered her hot tea to warm her trembling body. Now alone amidst the crowd of sick and injured people, Piper felt the weight of the world on her small shoulders. The tea cooled untouched between her hands, while her mind worked frantically, seeking an impossible solution. "I won't let you die, Jasper," she muttered to herself like a solemn promise. "I'll find a way to get this medicine, even if I have to cross the entire city under this storm. I promised our parents I would take care of you, and that's what I'll do until my last breath." While Piper sank into desperate thoughts, a sudden movement caught her attention. An elderly lady, with white hair tied in a simple bun and modest but clean clothes, was getting up from a nearby chair, leaning on a wooden cane. As she tried to grab her purse, the lady lost her balance for a moment and the purse fell, spilling its contents on the floor. Instinctively, even amid her own despair, Piper stood up to help. Years living on the streets had not hardened her heart or erased the lessons of kindness her parents had taught her. She knelt down and began collecting the lady's belongings: an embroidered handkerchief, a small prayer book, some medicines, and a leather wallet worn with use. "Let me help you, ma'am," Piper offered, gathering the objects carefully. "You shouldn't bend down like that with your cane. You could fall and hurt yourself." The wallet had opened when it fell, and Piper saw several bills inside, more money than she had seen together in a long time. For an instant, just a fleeting moment, a terrible thought crossed her mind. That money could buy Jasper's medicine. Nobody would need to know. It would be so easy to slip a few bills into the pocket of her damp dress. The idea made her pause for a second, her heart racing with the possibility of saving her brother, even if it meant doing something her parents would have disapproved of. But as quickly as it came, the thought was rejected. Piper closed the wallet without touching the money and handed it to the lady along with the other belongings, ignoring the desperate voice inside her that screamed, this might be Jasper's only chance. "Thank you very much, dear," the lady thanked her, surprised by the unexpected kindness. Nowadays it's rare to find people willing to help, especially someone so young and clearly going through difficulties of her own. "You're all wet and look exhausted. What is a girl like you doing alone in the hospital at this hour of the night?" Something in the lady's gentle voice made Piper's defenses crumble. Perhaps it was the maternal tone that reminded her of her own mother. Perhaps it was simply the accumulation of hours of fear and despair, but Piper found herself telling the whole story: how she and Jasper had lost their parents, how they lived on the streets, how her brother had gradually fallen ill until reaching the critical state he was in now, how desperately she needed a medication she couldn't afford. The words came out in an emotional torrent, interrupted by occasional sobs that she tried to control. The lady listened in silence, her expression changing from surprise to deep compassion as Piper spoke. When the girl finally finished, the elderly woman had tears in her eyes. "You could have taken money from my wallet when it fell," the lady observed softly, with no accusation in her voice. "I saw how you looked at the money and hesitated. Many would have taken advantage of the opportunity, especially with such an urgent reason as saving a brother's life. But you chose to be honest, even in your moment of greatest need. That says a lot about your character, little one." Before Piper could respond, the lady opened her purse again and took out something that shone under the hospital lights: a small golden brooch with intricate details and a red stone in the center. It was clearly an old and valuable piece, the kind of object that would pass from generation to generation in a family. The lady held it for a moment, as if saying goodbye to an old friend, before extending it to Piper. "This brooch belonged to my grandmother, and before her to her mother's mother," explained the lady, placing the precious object in Piper's small, dirty hand. "It is the most valuable item I own, not just in money, but in memories. But memories don't save lives, and your brother needs it more than I do now. There's a pawn shop 2 blocks from here near the pharmacy on the corner. They should still be open, despite the hour. Sell this and buy the medicine for your brother. It's all I can do for you." Piper looked at the brooch in her hand, unable to believe the incomprehensible generosity of this stranger. The jewel captured the light and reflected it in small rainbows, as if it contained hope in its very structure. It was heavy, substantial, clearly valuable. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were not of despair, but of gratitude so deep that it seemed to overflow from her small body. She tried to return the brooch, arguing that it was too precious, that she couldn't accept something so valuable from a stranger, but the lady gently closed Piper's fingers around the jewel. "A life is worth more than any material object, dear," the lady said firmly. "I've had a long life full of memories to cherish. Your brother deserves the chance to create his own. Go now, quickly, before the shop closes. And when your brother is better, remember to always extend your kindness to others, as you did to me today." With her heart overflowing with renewed hope, Piper thanked the lady with words broken by emotion and ran to the hospital exit. The rain had diminished somewhat, transforming into a persistent drizzle that still wet the streets and sidewalks. But Piper hardly noticed the moisture now. All her attention was focused on the mission of saving her brother. The brooch was safe in her closed hand, practically hidden to avoid drawing attention. The streets were almost deserted at that hour, just a few occasional cars passing quickly, their headlights creating ghostly glimmers in the puddles of water. Piper ran as fast as her tired legs allowed, mentally counting the steps to the pawn shop the lady had mentioned. "Just hold on a little longer, Jasper," she whispered as she ran, as if her brother could hear her across the distance. "I'm coming back with your medicine. We'll stay together as we promised. Just a little more fight, my brave little brother." Adrenaline propelled Piper forward, even when her muscles protested in pain. She could already see the pawn shop sign a block away, a yellowish neon light that blinked intermittently in the rainy night. So focused was she on her goal that she didn't notice the two figures that emerged from a dark alley and began following her. Only when she was a few meters from the store did Piper notice the quick footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw two teenagers approaching, their predatory expressions visible even in the semi-darkness of the poorly lit street. One of them, the taller one, had a cut on his eyebrow and a malicious smile that made Piper freeze in fear. The other was smaller, but his eyes had a calculating coldness that she immediately recognized. They were eyes that had seen too much, too young, eyes that belonged to someone who had learned to survive at the expense of others. "Hey, kid, what do you have there in your hand that you're holding so carefully?" asked the taller one, moving even closer. "We saw you leaving the hospital as if you'd won the lottery. Must be something valuable, right? Why not share with your friends from the street?" Fear took hold of Piper, a fear different from what she had felt for Jasper. This was a primordial, instinctive fear, the kind of fear that makes your heart race and your mouth dry. She knew boys like these, knew the harsh rules of life on the streets. They were older and bigger, and Piper knew the dangers she faced alone on the streets at night. But the thought of Jasper, lying in that hospital bed, fighting for each breath, gave Piper a courage she didn't know she possessed. She gripped the brooch more tightly in her hand and took a step back, her eyes frantically searching for an escape route. "I have nothing for you," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs. "Please, let me pass. My brother is very sick. I need to get to the store before it closes. It's an emergency." Her words fell on deaf ears. The boys exchanged a quick glance and advanced simultaneously, one blocking Piper's path to the pawn shop, the other positioning himself behind her, cutting off her escape route. The message was clear. They wouldn't let her pass without taking whatever she was hiding. Piper felt despair growing again. So close. She was so close to saving Jasper, only to be stopped just meters away from the solution. The injustice of the situation ignited something inside her, a fierce determination that surpassed even her fear. "It's to save my brother's life," she shouted, her voice echoing in the empty street. "He will die if I don't get the medicine. Please show some compassion. You must have loved someone too." For a moment it seemed her words had touched something in the teenagers. The smaller one hesitated, his gaze faltering briefly. But the taller one just laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that cut through the humid air like a knife. "I don't care about your brother, Pipsqueak," he replied, advancing another step. "It's every man for himself in this world. Now be a good girl and hand over what you've got in your hand, or we'll have to take it by force." Piper realized there was no diplomatic solution. They wouldn't be moved, wouldn't back down. In an impulsive decision born of pure desperation, she pretended to try to pass by the smaller boy, only to change direction at the last moment and run with all her speed toward the street. It was a risky maneuver, but the surprise worked for a crucial instant. Piper ran as she had never run before, her feet barely touching the wet ground, the brooch clutched in her hand as if it were Jasper's heart itself. She could hear the heavy footsteps of the teenagers behind her, their curses echoing in the night. She was almost reaching the other side of the street when she felt fingers grab her dress, pulling her back. "You're not going anywhere with our merchandise," growled the larger boy, pulling Piper forcefully. In a desperate struggle, Piper tried to break free, kicking and twisting with a strength born of pure survival instinct, not for herself, but for Jasper. Her fingers closed even more tightly around the brooch, her nails digging into her own palm. The fight lasted only seconds, but it seemed an eternity. In a final movement to free herself, Piper managed to tear her dress from the aggressor's hands, but the momentum made her stumble and fall forward directly onto the wet street. That's when she heard the sound, the roar of an engine approaching rapidly, followed by the sharp screech of tires trying to brake on wet asphalt. Piper turned toward the sound, only to be blinded by the bright lights of headlights rapidly approaching. "Jasper, forgive me," was her only thought as the car came toward her, seemingly unable to stop in time. "I tried, little brother." "I swear I tried until the end." The surgical center of the hospital was an almost sacred space where life and death waged their most intense battles. The white, merciless lights revealed every detail of Piper's small, fragile body, now unconscious on the operating table. The medical team moved with urgent precision around her, their tense expressions reflecting the gravity of the situation. The impact of the accident had been serious. Piper suffered severe injuries and was unconscious. The medical team worked intensely to stabilize her, forming a painful contrast with the extreme pallor of her skin. Monitors beeped around her, measuring each weak beat of her heart, each breath assisted by life support equipment. Outside the room, through the observation window, an elegantly dressed man watched the scene with eyes wide with horror. Sterling, still wearing the same expensive suit from the business dinner, now stained with Piper's blood. "How could I do this? How could I ignore a child begging for help and now be responsible for almost killing her?" he muttered to himself, hands pressed against the glass as if wanting to pass through it. "What kind of monster have I become?" The chief surgeon worked feverishly to contain the bleeding in Piper's brain, his precise movements contrasting with the urgency of the situation. Every second was precious. Every moment of hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. The heart monitor recorded increasingly weak beats, an alarming sign that the girl's small body was losing the battle. A nurse new to the team noticed something strange. Even unconscious under the effect of powerful sedatives, Piper kept her right hand firmly closed, her pale fingers contracted as if in a last desperate attempt to hold on to something important. The nurse gently tried to open the girl's fingers, thinking she might be holding something that needed to be removed before the operation could continue, but found surprising resistance. It was as if, even on the brink of death, Piper refused to let go of the object she was holding. "She won't let go, doctor," the nurse reported, concerned. "Her fingers are so tightly closed that I fear hurting her if I force them. I've never seen anything like this before, especially in someone so young and in such serious condition." Outside the operating room, Sterling paced back and forth, a figure tormented by the weight of guilt. His driver, a middle-aged man who had served him for years, remained a few steps behind, equally shaken by the accident. Everything had happened so quickly. The girl suddenly appearing in front of the car, the desperate attempt to brake, the horrible sound of impact. But what truly tormented Sterling wasn't just the accident itself, but the recognition. The moment he saw the small body on the wet asphalt, he recognized her immediately. The same girl who had begged for his help hours before, the same child he had dismissed with disdain, as if she were merely an inconvenience in his perfect day. The universe, in its cruel irony, had placed her life in his hands not once but twice in the same day, and both times he had failed terribly. Seeing that the girl was still breathing after the impact, Sterling had immediately ordered his driver to take them to the best hospital in the city, not the public hospital where accident victims would normally be sent, but the private clinic where the elite of society received exclusive care. "We have to do more than just save her," Sterling told his driver, his voice choked with an emotion he rarely displayed. "I have to fix what I did. And I'm not just talking about the accident, but what happened before when I could have helped and chose to do nothing." While doctors fought to keep Piper alive in another room in another hospital, the public hospital that Piper had left to seek medication for her brother, Jasper was fighting his own battle against death. His small body, already weakened by days of fever and poor nutrition, was losing the ability to combat the infection consuming his lungs. Dr. Sinclair observed the monitors with growing concern, noting how the oxygen saturation gradually decreased, how the fever refused to yield even with the available medications. It was a battle she had seen many times in her career. Poor children arriving too late for treatment, without resources for essential medications, without families able to help. Usually these stories ended in the same tragic way, but something about Jasper and his dedicated sister had deeply touched the experienced doctor. She had done everything to obtain the necessary medication, contacting other health units, begging the hospital administration, but without success. Now all that remained was to wait and hope that Jasper's young body would find strength where there seemed to be none. "Where is your sister, little one?" whispered the doctor, adjusting the oxygen feeding into Jasper's nostrils. "She promised to come back to you, and I've never seen such determination in someone so young. Hold on a little longer." Back at the elite hospital, an administrative nurse approached Sterling with a clipboard in hand, her face a mask of professionalism that barely hid the curiosity about why one of the richest and most powerful men in the city was so devastated by an accident with a street girl. She needed information for the hospital record, but all they knew was that the patient's name was Piper. No surname, no documents, no formal registration in the system. Sterling looked at the clipboard almost in a trance, as if the questions there were written in a language he could no longer understand. How could he fill in the gaps of a child's life that he didn't know, that he had ignored when she needed him most? It was then that the nurse, perhaps moved by compassion or perhaps just following protocol, mentioned something that changed everything. The object that the girl was holding so tightly. "We've identified what she's holding so firmly," the nurse informed. "It's an antique brooch, apparently valuable. The doctor believes it may have sentimental value, since she won't release it even while unconscious. Perhaps it belongs to her family." The mention of the brooch sparked Sterling's curiosity. Why would a street child be clutching a valuable object with such determination, especially when she was literally running for her life? He asked to see the object, but was informed that this would be impossible without hurting the patient. Determined to better understand the situation, Sterling began questioning the medical team, the paramedics who had first arrived at the scene, anyone who might have information about Piper. It was then that one of the doctors casually mentioned that before losing consciousness completely during transport, Piper had repeatedly mumbled about her brother, about a medicine, about how she needed to reach the pawn shop before it closed. The pieces started to fall into place in Sterling's mind. The desperate plea earlier that day, the mention of a sick brother needing medication, the valuable brooch, the frantic run through the rainy street. "My God!" exclaimed Sterling, the realization hitting him like a punch to the stomach. She was trying to sell the brooch to buy medicine for her brother. She was running to save his life when my car hit her. The guilt already consuming Sterling intensified tenfold. It wasn't enough that he had ignored a desperate child's plea for help. Now he had been directly responsible for preventing her from saving her brother. 2 young, innocent lives were hanging by a thread because of his indifference, his selfishness, his lack of basic humanity. With a determination born of guilt and remorse, Sterling grabbed his phone and began making calls, using all his power and influence to locate Piper's brother. It didn't take long. The world of the privileged has its advantages, and he soon discovered that a boy named Jasper had been admitted to the public hospital with severe pneumonia, urgently needing a specific and expensive medication that wasn't available at that facility. The boy was rapidly deteriorating, with increasingly slim chances of survival without proper treatment. "Send the best pediatric pneumonia specialist immediately to the public hospital," Sterling ordered his assistant over the phone. "Buy all available stock of that medication regardless of price, and prepare to transfer the boy here as soon as he's stable enough to be moved. These children will not die today, not because of me. Spare no expense, understood? No cost is too high." Inside the operating room, the battle for Piper's life reached its most critical moment. The trauma to her brain had caused dangerous swelling, increasing intracranial pressure to alarming levels. The doctors had done everything within their power, drained the accumulated blood, administered medications to reduce swelling, stabilized secondary fractures. Now it was a matter of waiting and watching, of hoping the young body would respond to treatment. But the signs weren't promising. The heart monitor showed increasingly weak and irregular beats, Blood pressure was gradually falling, oxygenation decreasing despite maximum support. The medical team exchanged worried glances, mentally preparing for the worst. Even in the best hospitals, with the best doctors and equipment, there are limits to what medicine can do. Sometimes the damage is simply too great, life too fragile. "We are losing her," announced the chief surgeon, his voice calm but tense beneath the surgical mask. "Prepare resuscitation protocol. I want a unit of blood ready and epinephrine available immediately." Outside the room, Sterling watched with growing horror, witnessing Piper's life literally slipping away before his eyes. The nurses moved more quickly now, bringing additional equipment into the room, preparing for the moment when the girl's heart would completely stop. That's when he noticed something strange. Amid all the tension and movement, Piper's closed hand began to relax slightly, as if she was finally ready to release the brooch she had protected with such determination. It was as if, even unconscious, she somehow knew that her mission had been transferred to other hands, that her brother was no longer alone in the fight for survival. This small gesture, this silent surrender, hit Sterling in a way that no words could. Tears flowed freely down his face, something that hadn't happened since his distant childhood. "Don't give up, Piper," he murmured, his words directed at the girl who couldn't hear him. "Your brother needs you, and I need the chance to fix what I've done. Please, fight a little longer." Meanwhile, at the public hospital, Jasper's situation took a sudden and dramatic turn. The team of specialists sent by Sterling had arrived with impressive speed, bringing not only the necessary medication, but also advanced equipment and expertise that were rarely available in that public facility. Dr. Sinclair watched with a mixture of surprise and relief as the new treatment was administered. As more modern monitors were installed, as her small patient finally received the care he deserved from the beginning. But her mind was divided between relief for Jasper's chance and concern for Piper, who had not returned as promised. Where was the girl who had demonstrated such courage and determination? Had she gotten the money for the medicine? Had she encountered difficulties in the dangerous streets at night? The doctor had no answers, only a disturbing feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. "Who sent you? Who is paying for all this?" Dr. Sinclair asked the specialist doctor who led the new team. "I've been working at this hospital for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this, especially for a child without resources or influential family." In the operating room, Piper's condition worsened. The monitors indicated that her heart had stopped beating, and the medical team immediately initiated emergency procedures. The medical team acted quickly, starting all the necessary procedures to try to revive Piper. Each professional knew exactly what to do in that critical situation. It was a choreographed dance of precise movements, each team member knowing exactly what to do, when to do it, how to do it. Sterling watched through the window, his eyes fixed on the monitor that showed the flat line, the absence of life where before there had been at least a weak pulse. Seconds turned into minutes, minutes into an eternity of suspense and despair. Time was running against Piper. After 4 minutes without oxygenation, the brain begins to suffer irreversible damage. After 10 minutes, the chances of recovery are practically nil. "Continue compressions," ordered the chief surgeon, his forehead now covered with sweat despite the refrigerated environment. "This patient is young and previously healthy. Let's give her every possible chance." The medical team worked tirelessly, taking turns with chest compressions to maintain constant strength and rhythm. Medication after medication was administered. Increasingly aggressive techniques were attempted, but the monitor continued to show that devastating straight line. After 15 minutes of intense efforts, the chief surgeon looked at the clock, then at the monitor, and finally at his exhausted team. There were rules, protocols, medical realities that could not be ignored. There came a moment when persisting was no longer responsible medicine, but rather the refusal to accept the inevitable. With a deep and painful sigh, he lowered his hands, signaling for the team to stop compressions. "Time of death," he began, his voice heavy with the defeat that never became easier, no matter how many times it was experienced. That's when it happened. So subtle at first that no one noticed, then unmistakable. A small spike appeared on the cardiac monitor, followed by another and another. Weak, irregular, but definitely present. The flat line had been replaced by a series of undulations indicating a heart struggling to return to life. The team looked in silence for a moment, almost afraid to believe before going into renewed action, now with the goal of stabilizing and strengthening this fragile return. Outside, Sterling fell to his knees, his normally impeccable posture completely forgotten, as he whispered words of gratitude to a God he hadn't believed in for years. It was a medical miracle, or perhaps something deeper, the physical manifestation of the same fierce determination that had kept Piper fighting for her brother against all obstacles. "She's coming back," exclaimed a nurse, her voice breaking the tense silence of the room. "We have heart rhythm, weak but present, pressure slowly rising. This girl is a fighter." While the team worked to stabilize Piper, Sterling received news from the public hospital. The medication was taking effect, and Jasper was showing the first signs of improvement. His oxygen saturation was rising, the fever finally beginning to subside, his lungs responding to the aggressive treatment. It was too early to declare victory, the doctors warned. The boy was still very sick, still facing a long road to complete recovery. But for the first time since he had been admitted, there was real, tangible hope. The scale that had previously tipped heavily toward death now began to slowly tilt in the direction of life. Sterling felt a relief so profound it nearly choked him. One of the two young people for whom he was responsible seemed to be emerging from immediate danger. Now everything depended on Piper continuing her own fight, on her traumatized brain having been spared permanent damage, on her indomitable spirit remaining intact through the physical trauma. "Mr. Sterling called a doctor, approaching with a grave expression. "We've managed to stabilize the girl for now, but I need to be honest. The situation is still extremely critical. The cranial trauma is severe, and we still don't know the extent of the brain damage. The next 24 hours will be decisive." The doctor continued explaining the situation in technical terms that Sterling barely understood, talking about intracranial pressure, diffuse axonal injury, cerebral contusions. But the businessman grasped the essentials. Piper had survived the impossible, had literally come back from death, but her battle was far from over. She would remain in a medically induced coma for the next few days, to give her brain the best chance of recovery. There were no guarantees. She could wake up perfectly fine, could have permanent sequelae, or might never wake up. It was a torturous wait that no money or power could shorten. For the first time in his adult life, Sterling faced a situation he could not control, manipulate, or buy a solution for. "I will do everything in my power to save these children," Sterling told the doctor, his voice finding renewed firmness. "Any specialist, any experimental treatment, any medical center in the world, regardless of cost. And meanwhile, I want to know more about them, how they ended up on the streets, what happened to their parents, how I can help them beyond immediate medical care." In the hours that followed, while Piper remained stabilized but critical, and Jasper slowly responded to treatment, Sterling used his contacts and resources to discover the children's story. What he learned only increased his feelings of guilt and responsibility. Piper and Jasper's parents had died in a fire a few months earlier, leaving the children completely alone in the world. Without relatives who could or would care for them, without resources to support themselves, they had ended up on the streets, surviving on small occasional jobs and the reluctant charity of strangers. Piper, at only 9 years old, had taken on the responsibility of caring for her younger brother, protecting him from the dangers of the street, seeking food and shelter, assuming a role that no child should ever need to assume. And when Jasper fell ill, she hadn't hesitated to do the unthinkable, offering herself in a form of servitude to save her brother. The courage and sacrifice of this child, contrasted with his own selfish indifference, hit Sterling like never before. "How could I have become this kind of person?" he asked aloud to the empty room where he awaited news. "When did I stop seeing others suffering? When did money and power become more important than basic humanity?" The night advanced slowly, the hours dragging while Piper and Jasper fought their parallel battles in separate rooms, in different hospitals. Sterling refused to go home, to leave the hospital even for a few hours to rest. He alternated between anxiously walking the corridors and sitting motionless for long periods, lost in dark and self-critical thoughts. The golden brooch they had finally managed to remove from Piper's unconscious hand now rested in his suit pocket, a tangible reminder of the sacrifice and determination of a child he had judged worthless. His phone rang constantly, assistants, partners, lawyers, all wanting his attention for matters that once seemed urgent and now sounded trivial and empty. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, Sterling was truly facing the consequences of his choices, his way of living, his distorted values, and the self-assessment was devastating. "Save these children," he whispered like a prayer, looking through the hospital window at the city now sleeping under a sky finally clear after the storm. "Give me the chance to fix what I've done, and I swear I will never again pass by someone in need without stopping to help." A week had passed since the fateful night of the storm. The hospital corridors, once cold and impersonal, now seemed almost familiar to Sterling. For 7 days and nights he had remained there, refusing to leave while Piper fought for her life. His elegant suit had long been replaced by simpler clothes brought by his driver, his normally clean-shaven face now covered with stubble, his eyes marked by deep, dark circles that testified to sleepless nights. For those who knew him before, the transformation was shocking. Not just physical, but something deeper had changed in him, any change in the vital signs. Sterling asked the nurse leaving Piper's room, the same question he repeated almost every hour, every day. During that week, Sterling had mobilized resources that most people didn't even know existed. Specialists in brain trauma were brought from other countries, cutting-edge equipment was purchased and installed, experimental medications were imported with special authorizations. To Jasper, now transferred to the same hospital as his sister, the best pediatric pulmonologists monitored his recovery day and night. Money, which was once the center of Sterling's life, was now just a tool to try to repair the irreparable. While waiting and observing, Sterling had discovered more about the two children. How their parents had died in a fire, how they were left with no one to care for them, how they survived on the streets with only Piper's courage and Jasper's resilience. "Mr. Sterling, I think you should see this," called the chief doctor, hurrying out of Piper's room. "Her brain patterns are changing. She may be beginning to wake up." Sterling's heart raced as he entered the silent room where Piper was resting. After days in an induced coma, the doctors had finally reduced the sedation, allowing her brain to try to find its way back to consciousness. Her small body seemed even smaller in the hospital bed, surrounded by equipment and monitors. The external injuries were beginning to heal, but no one could say with certainty what they would find when, and if, she woke up. Brain damage was unpredictable, especially in cases as severe as hers. Sterling sat in the chair beside the bed, the same one where he had spent countless hours in recent days. He took Piper's small hand in his, noticing how delicate it was, how fragile it seemed, but also remembering the surprising strength with which she had held the brooch throughout the ordeal. This hand so small had carried her brother through the streets, had extended in supplication, had fought to save what she loved. "Piper," he called softly, "if you can hear me, I want you to know that Jasper is fine. You did it. You saved your brother." It was almost imperceptible at first, a slight tremor in her eyelids, a change in her breathing rhythm. Then, slowly, like someone emerging from the depths of a dark ocean, Piper's eyes began to open. Confused, unfocused at first, blinking against the room light that seemed too bright after days of darkness. Sterling held his breath, his heart beating so hard it felt like it would explode in his chest. The doctors had warned about possible sequelae, difficulty speaking, memory loss, personality changes, motor problems. Jasper was the first word that came from Piper's dry lips, almost inaudible, but clear as a bell to Sterling. "Where is my brother?" Sterling felt tears welling in his eyes. Of all possible first words, pain, confusion, fear, she chose to worry about her brother. Even after everything she had been through, her first thought was for Jasper. A strange and unfamiliar emotion filled Sterling's chest, something he hadn't felt for so long he almost didn't recognize it. Pure admiration, not for wealth or power, but for something infinitely more valuable, selfless and unwavering love. "Jasper is fine, Piper," he replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Thanks to you, he received the medication he needed. He's recovering quickly." Piper's eyes, still confused, focused on Sterling. A flash of recognition crossed her face, followed by something that looked like fear. She tried to move away, her weak body barely responding to commands. "You, from the restaurant," she mumbled, memory returning in fragments. "What happened? Where am I?" Sterling hesitated. How to explain everything? How to tell her about the accident, about how he almost killed her after denying help, about how his selfishness had nearly cost 2 innocent lives. The doctors had advised not to overwhelm her with traumatic information so early, to let her recover more before facing painful memories. But looking into Piper's frightened eyes, Sterling felt he owed her at least honesty. "There was an accident, Piper," he said gently. "You were hit by a car when you were running to sell the brooch. I was in the car. I brought you to this hospital, and I've been taking care of you and Jasper since then." "I'm sorry, more than I can express." Before Piper could process this information, the door to the room opened. Jasper ran in, his face lit up with a huge smile, his light steps showing no sign of the illness that had almost killed him. During the week of recovery, while Piper remained unconscious, Sterling had spent many hours with the boy, telling him stories, bringing him toys, ensuring he felt safe and loved while they waited for Piper to wake up. "Piper, you're awake!" shouted Jasper, running to the bed and climbing onto it with the agility of a completely recovered child. "I knew you'd come back. I knew it." Piper's weak arms embraced her brother, tears flowing freely down her face. The embrace lasted long minutes, as if the siblings needed to reassure themselves of each other's presence, confirm that it wasn't just a dream. Sterling observed the scene, feeling simultaneously part of it and an intruder, the man who had almost destroyed this sacred bond between siblings, but also the one who had helped preserve it. "Look, Piper," Jasper said excitedly, moving back a little. "Mr. Sterling gave me this. He showed a small toy airplane, and he said we're going to live in a big house with a garden. It's true, isn't it?" Piper looked confusedly at Sterling, who felt the weight of that gaze like a judgment. It was time for the truth to discover if redemption was possible for someone like him. "Piper," Sterling began, carefully choosing his words, "during these days, while taking care of you, I learned more than I have in my entire adult life. I was a cruel and indifferent man, so consumed by money and power that I forgot what really matters. I can never fully repair what I did, the pain I caused, but if you give me a chance, I want to offer you a home, education, and all the care you deserve." There was a prolonged silence. Jasper anxiously looked between his sister and Sterling, sensing the tension, but not completely understanding. Piper studied the man's face, looking for something, sincerity perhaps, or some sign that she could trust this surprising offer. "Why would you do this?" she finally asked, her voice small but firm. "Out of guilt?" "At first, yes," Sterling admitted, determined to be completely honest. "But now, it's something more. You reminded me what it is to be human, what it is to love unconditionally as you love Jasper, what it is to sacrifice for someone. I want to learn more of these lessons, and if you allow me, I want to give you the childhood you deserve." Piper looked at Jasper, who smiled hopefully. Then she turned her gaze back to Sterling. "You didn't buy my brother that day," she finally said, "but you saved our lives today." Slowly, she extended her small hand to hold Sterling's. "I think we all deserve a second chance." Months later, Sterling's large mansion echoed with a sound that had long been absent: children's laughter. In the spacious garden, Jasper ran chasing a ball, his energy seemingly inexhaustible, his body completely recovered from the illness that had almost killed him. In the elegant library, Piper sat at an antique desk, absorbed in her studies. Her recovery had been slower, more difficult. Some days still brought headaches, and occasionally her right hand trembled when she was tired. But her mind remained sharp, her determination intact, and she absorbed knowledge with a thirst that impressed even the most experienced tutors. Sterling observed the children from afar, through the window of his rarely used office. His business continued, of course, but no longer occupied the center of his existence. He had discovered a greater purpose, a more meaningful mission than accumulating wealth, using his resources to make a difference in the lives of vulnerable children like Piper and Jasper had been. On the wall behind his desk, a recent photograph showed Sterling, Piper, and Jasper cutting the inaugural ribbon of the Renewed Hope Foundation, created in honor of the children's parents. The foundation offered shelter, education, and medical care to street children, especially those without family. Mr. Sterling? Piper's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood at the office door, a book in her hands, her now healthy and shiny hair tied in a braid. Yes, Piper? Thank you, she said simply, for everything. As she turned to return to her studies, Sterling felt a wave of gratitude. The little beggar who once pleaded for help had not only saved her brother but had also saved the soul of a man who had forgotten the value of compassion. And that, he realized, was a gift infinitely more valuable than any wealth he had ever possessed. If the story of Piper, Jasper, and Sterling moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment where you're from. And don't go anywhere. The next story is already appearing on screen, made especially for you. See you soon.